guys, welcome back, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Shayna, and in my little corner of the internet, we talk about spooky history of all kinds. If that sounds like something you're interested in, be sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell because I upload every week. Or if podcasts are more your thing, I do have a podcast called Spooky History with Shayna Blake, and that is where the audio of all my videos go. So I will be sure to have a link down in the description for you. So in my last video, I mentioned that the killer's dad was named Jesse James Gray, and that kind of made me think, you know, I've heard of Jesse James my whole life, but I never really knew his real story other than he robbed and killed people. He was like the infamous Jesse James, right? Well, I watched a documentary about him and did some internet research and found out that his story is actually pretty interesting. So let's dive in. Now, Jesse was born as Jesse Woodson James in Clay County, Missouri on September 5th of 1847. So I guess happy birthday. He would have been 175. That's interesting. He was the third of 4 children born to Robert and Zerelda James. Both of his parents were from Kentucky, and Jesse had an older brother named Frank and a brother named Robert who died when he was a baby, and then he had a younger sister named Susan. Now, his father Robert was a slave-owning farmer and a Baptist minister. Robert would die when James was only 3 years old. Now, the James family owned a 100-acre farm, so when Zerelda became a widow, she needed to find someone who could help take care of her and her 3 children. So she would end up remarrying a doctor named Reuben Samuel. Now, Zerelda was a very strong-willed and opinionated woman and was essentially the head of the household. The whole family listened to her and did exactly what she said. James was both popular and very outwardly religious in his small community. Many people who lived in the same town as him believed he would grow up to become a preacher, but that couldn't have been farther from the truth, unfortunately. And the Civil War is what would help change those plans. Now, if you're watching or even listening to this video and you're not in the United States, you may not have grown up hearing about the Civil War like we have. It was an American war that was fought between the United States of America and the Confederate States of America. I know, confusing, right? Now, there were 11 states that would leave the Union, aka the United States of America, and would call themselves the Confederate States of America in 1860 and 1861. And the conflict began primarily as a result of the long-standing disagreement over the institution of slavery. So the Union were people of the northern parts of America. They fought for reunification, whereas the South claimed to fight for independence. But as the war progressed, it turned into more of a social, economic, and political revolution with unforeseen consequences. Now, the Union war effort expanded to include not only reunification, but also to abolish slavery. Then the Confederates, who were the people of the South, would support slavery and states' rights. Their whole thing was they didn't want the government to say what they could and couldn't do on their own property. And this is what would cause the Confederate soldiers in the South's decision to withdraw from the Union. Many were motivated to fight in order to preserve the institution of slavery. Very different times back then. Just gonna say. Now, with the James family being slave owners with Southern roots, they would join Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson in supporting the Confederacy during the Civil War. Frank James fought at the Battle of Wilson's Creek under the command of General Sterling Price, and then would later join up with the Confederate guerrillas and raiders. Now, we will talk about the Confederate guerrillas later. Trust me, we need to. But back then, the state of Missouri was a border state between the Union side and the Confederate side, meaning that there were people who either supported the Union or supported the Confederates. So you could be supporting the North and your neighbor could be supporting the South, which would make it a pretty dangerous place to be. Now, there were vicious attacks that were made by both the Union militia and the Confederate raiders. Each side took a part in harming civilians and crippling the economy. So in 1863, the Union soldiers would come to visit the James family farm. They were looking for information about the Confederate guerrillas because they knew that Frank was in the Confederate guerrillas, so that's why they went to his house to get information. And when they didn't get any information, the soldiers would hurt and threaten Jesse and his family. They even threw Zerelda in prison for a short period of time. And it was because of this incident that Jesse James would decide to join his brother and become a Confederate guerrilla in the gang that was led by William Anderson, who is also known as Bloody Bill. Now, Jesse would then learn how to live his life in a specific pattern, plan an attack, then flee and hide. So now let's talk a little bit about the Civil War guerrillas. During the American Civil War, groups of these so-called partisan rangers would engage in bloody campaigns of guerrilla attacks. They would raid and cause psychological warfare against rival military units and civilians. These units would have ties to the regular Confederate and Union armies and were led by men who often operated outside the recognized rules of warfare. So essentially, if you wanted something done, war-related of course, that you knew was bad but didn't want to get in trouble for it, you would have one of these gangs do it for you. And these people in these groups were essentially murderers that would get away with killing for a cause. Now, William C. Cantrell was one of the most infamous figures in this war. Before the war, he was a school teacher and a gambler, but once the war broke out, he would assemble a ragtag band of guerrillas and began harassing and killing Union forces and their sympathizers that lived or were stationed along the Missouri-Kansas border. His exploits would end up earning him a rank as captain from the Confederate Army, but in turn would make him an outlaw by the Union. A fun fact, many of the famous outlaws of the American West started out as members of these guerrilla units during the Civil War. The tactics these outlaws learned were from guerrilla warfare, including raiding, robbery, and evading capture, and this would later prove invaluable to these men during their outlaw career. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Now let's talk a little bit about William Anderson, aka Bloody Bill. Bloody Bill was a vicious human being. Okay, he killed for the fun of it. He would get his name Bloody Bill because of the cold-blooded acts he did on the Union soldiers. Now Bill is what we will call him. He entered the Civil War with a well-established outlaw reputation, having already murdered a judge who had killed his father over accusations of horse theft. So Bill was a very bold and arrogant man. He would go alongside William, who originated the guerrillas, and would participate in his raiders in 1863. Then soon would begin leading his own attacks against the Union forces. Now, when one of Bill's sisters were captured by the Union soldiers and then she was killed in an accidental building collapse, Bill's rage against the Union would intensify into this severe hatred for them. Now, when Bill would do raids, he would develop these tactics that included cutting off enemies' ears, decapitation, and even scalping. Horrific stuff. And then in 1864, Bill would lead a band of guerrillas to attack and butcher 22 unarmed Union soldiers. Now, when the Union troops were sent in pursuit, Bill dressed in a stolen federal uniform and then ambushed them and slaughtered another 120 men. In the summer before this raid, Jesse James was actually shot in the chest, but by the time this raid Bill led happened, and he was killing all these people, Jesse was well enough to participate. So they believe he saw all the gruesome acts that were being done and was participating in them, which is really sad because, I mean, keep in mind, Jesse would have been 17 at this time. I could not imagine what this would have done to his mental state. It had to have really demented how he saw things. It's just absolutely horrible. Now, the Union was furious and they were ready to put an end to the notorious Bloody Bill. So they would put together a small militia to personally hunt him down. It would be in October of 1864, that same year, that Bill was trapped and would be killed when he tried to charge the Union troops. Now, at the end of the war, Jesse was shot by Union cavalry men as he was attempting to surrender, but he ended up escaping, and his cousin Z. Mems, who he would later marry, would nurse him back to health. Now, while James was resting and recovering, his comrades took to robbing banks and stagecoaches. And then once Jesse was well again, he would begin his career as an outlaw. Now, up to this point, Jesse wasn't really known by anyone. No one had heard the name Jesse James yet? And that would all change in 1869 when Jesse and his gang would hold up the Daviess County Savings Bank in Gallatin, Missouri. Now, the only reason they even went to this bank was because they found out that the person who killed Bloody Bill managed this specific bank. So they go and end up shooting the person they thought was the man, but it ended up just being a cashier that worked there. So that was kind of a disappointment, but it didn't stop Jesse from boasting that he avenged Bloody Bill's death. He just wanted to claim that status that he did it. You know what I mean? Now, it was because of this incident, Jesse's name would finally appear in the papers in December of 1869. And this would be the beginning of Jesse's fame. He would grow to love and crave the attention he was getting. He demanded it, in fact. Jesse would write letters to an editor who was a Confederate sympathizer named John Newman Edwards. He would put his letters in the newspapers, but he kind of elaborated a little bit, made it seem a little more appealing and exciting. He was essentially praising Jesse as a Robin Hood figure and making him a symbol of Confederate defiance during a period of Reconstruction when Unionists were in charge of state government. Now, meanwhile, Jesse and Frank James would join Cole Younger and his brothers, who were also Confederate guerrillas. Now, the Jesse Younger gang would commit robberies all the way from Iowa to Texas and then from Kansas to West Virginia. They would rob banks, stagecoaches, and even a Kansas City fair. And then in 1873, their focus would shift to robbing trains. Now, they didn't steal money from passengers, but instead would steal from the train safe. Now, John, the editor that was writing about Jesse, would make Jesse look like the victim, who was stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. And that the reason that they were committing these robberies is for the cause, which couldn't have been farther from the truth. The money they were stealing, they kept for themselves. And they didn't really have a cause. I mean, yeah, they were still mad about how things ended after the war. Then again, if during the war, if you ever were a guerrilla fighter, people would look down on you. I mean, you couldn't really get good jobs. Your neighbors were against you. You know, you didn't get treated very well if you were known to be a guerrilla. I mean, because the Confederates lost. And most of these guerrilla fighters only knew the life of robbing, killing, and hiding. So it was hard for these men to go back to the simple life that they had before, which isn't an excuse, but I kind of get it, you know? But Jesse, he didn't want to go back because he enjoyed the fame. They would get wrapped up about what they were saying in the papers about him and would eventually start to believe that he was the Robin Hood of their time. And then on April 24th of 1874, Jesse would marry his cousin, Z. Mims, and they would have 4 children, a son named Jesse Jr., then Gould and Montgomery, who were twins, but they ended up dying when they were babies, and then they had a daughter named Mary. Now, around this time, the people were kind of getting tired of Jesse and his gang, you know, mainly because they were terrorizing people and it caused the economy in Missouri to hinder. And the leaders of Missouri were not very happy about it at all. They wanted Missouri to thrive, and it can't if there's a notorious murderous gang running around. So they would get in touch with the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and they were called to look into Jesse's whereabouts. Well, Pinkerton would send over one of his detectives to the town where Jesse's mom and her family lived. The detective would ask around town where Jesse and his family lived, and the people of the town strongly suggested that they just move on and not go to the house. In fact, they told him that he would die, essentially, if he tried. Well, this detective didn't take their advice, and he would be found the next day with a note attached to his chest. It said something along the lines of, "This is what happens when you try to find or try to mess with the James boys." Well, James and Frank weren't at home with his mom, so his mom had people kill this man. I mean, yeah, she was proud of what her boys were doing because they stood for a cause she believed in and no one was going to get in their way. Talk about low standards. Now, when Pinkerton found out what happened to his detective, he got mad. Him and his agents would travel to the town, creep up to the James's house in the middle of the night, and would toss a flare in their home. It would explode and kill Jesse's half-brother and injured his mother's hand. And well, this act would help give Jesse and his gang sympathy, believe it or not, because he was being targeted for what he believed in, which was standing up for the little guy, you know? So on September 7th of 1876, the James Younger gang would try to rob a bank in Northfield, Minnesota. Now this robbery ended in a disaster, okay? The Younger brothers got caught, and then the James brothers actually fled to Nashville, Tennessee. This was another miraculous feat for the James boys because they were being hunted by large parties of people that were trying to put a stop to James. And they traveled 500 miles and were never caught. And people saw this as admirable. I mean, it's pretty amazing. It kind of is. Now, once they were in Tennessee, they decided to change their names. Jesse was called Thomas Howard and Frank was called B.J. Woodson. Well, once they were settled, Frank would start a farm and he kind of enjoyed his new life as a simple farmer. But Jesse, he would start to get restless. His name was starting to fade in the papers, and this really bothered him. He was getting all of this attention for so long, and for it to just suddenly stop, it wasn't acceptable in his eyes. So he would eventually go on his own without Frank and would try to find a new gang. Now, the people he found weren't the guerrilla fighters he was used to, so they weren't trained like he was. They were sloppy and didn't really meet his expectations. And eventually he would start to get paranoid, thinking that they were out to get him or were stealing from him. And he even killed one of his own people in his gang because he was paranoid. And then by 1881, the governor had it with Jesse James and his gang. Jesse was continuing his fight for the cause, but the cause was already done and over with. I mean, the people have moved on. His time has ended, right? So Governor Thomas T. Crittenden issued a proclamation for the arrest of Frank and Jesse James. By 1882, Jesse had moved his family back to St. Joseph, Missouri. He was still using his new name, Thomas Howard, and would pass himself off as a cattle buyer and brought two new men, Robert and Charlie Ford, into his gang to help him scout banks for future robberies. Now, what Jesse didn't realize was that Robert had struck a deal with Governor Crittenden about getting a reward for capturing him, or he would pardon him if he just killed Jesse and ended it. So as the story goes, on April 3rd of 1882, Jesse was up on a chair in his house dusting a picture when Robert stood behind him and shot and killed Jesse James. The Ford brothers were tried for murder and were found guilty, but the governor pardoned them like he promised. Frank James would end up turning himself in, and for 16 long years, Jesse James and his gang robbed and murdered people in half a dozen states. They instilled fear in Missourians that restricted them from investing or starting businesses in that state. They didn't want to get robbed and murdered. So after Jesse's death, people would become less fearful, and Missouri would begin to grow and became a more peaceful and prosperous place to be. Now, Zerelda, the mother, would actually bury Jesse in her yard, saying it was so people didn't come mess with his grave, but she actually charged people to come and look at his grave. She was a sick woman. Just saying. And friends and family members of Jesse who had supported and protected him during the years as a raider and outlaw still stayed loyal to him even after his death. And then Jesse later became the subject of countless songs, books, articles, festivals, and movies, which all paint him in a different light. But in reality, Jesse was a horrible murderer and thief who loved the spotlight and just couldn't let it go. I mean, he possibly would have never been caught if he just laid low with his brother. But he just couldn't. He couldn't settle down. But that's it. That's Jesse James. I hope you guys enjoyed this history lesson on Jesse James. If you did and are watching on YouTube, be sure to hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell so you don't miss any of my future uploads. Or if you're listening on my podcast, be sure to leave me a review if you can. Either way, I'm just happy you guys are here watching and listening. I hope you all have a very blessed day, and I will see you all later. Bye.